Welcome to SILS Connections. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Lori Haight, and our guest today is Sofía Becerra-Licha, talking about her role as lead archivist at the Kennedy Center. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to put those into the chat, and I'll serve as moderator. There'll also be time at the end if you want to unmute and ask questions directly. Sofía, thank you for joining us today.
Of course, I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So our goal with this Alumni Connections event is that we wanted to go a little bit deeper into what your current role is and how you got there. And then because we're doing a theme today of DC people, we're going to also talk to you about living and working in DC.
Sure.
But to get started, we did put your bio in our marketing materials, but could you tell us more about your career path in finding archival roles?
Sure. So, like a lot of my colleagues, but not necessarily everyone, I took a bit of a meandering path to library science. I majored in music and Spanish as an undergrad. I taught high school Spanish for a year. I pursued a master's in music with a concentration in ethnomusicology. And I also was heavily involved on campus in both of those degrees. And originally I thought I was going to be a teacher, a professor, but eventually I realized that what I really enjoyed and thrived with in retrospect was organizing things, documenting, and above all, connecting people with information. I was born in Puerto Rico, was raised both in the US and in Puerto Rico, and so I think there's a big element of just translating, finding common language, and making sure that things persevere and are findable. So I went to UNC. I graduated in 2012. While I was at UNC, I did a lot of things. I was a Cala at the Stone Center Library. And because I was coming in without a lot of library experience, I really tried to cram in as much as I could. So I also did a field experience and later an assistantship doing music cataloging with the Southern Folklife Collection. I crammed in some volunteer hours over at Duke at the Sally Bingham Center to get some archival processing experience. And right after I graduated, I ended up taking an extra semester to be able to fit in another elective. And I was able to do a fellowship actually here in DC. So I actually was finishing my master's paper and also doing a Latino Museum Studies program fellowship with the Smithsonian Latino Center. Again, I have a lot of interest, and it has served me well with where I've ended up. I guess the other caveat that I usually give when I'm talking about my background is I've worked very hard. I've been very strategic, but I fully admit, that where I've ended up has also had an element of luck. And so my first position, like a lot of archivists, was a project position, but it was a project position that became permanent, which just doesn't happen in all cases.
Mm-hmm.
So my first professional position was at Berklee College of Music, where I established their college archives, so from the ground up. And I actually have some photos and things. I put together some slides if it's helpful to walk through things at some point. And so it was a great first position because I had to do a little bit of everything. I was wearing multiple hats. And it's a case in which all of the different SILS experiences that I had really came in handy. So working at the Stone Center Library, I'd hired student workers, which I was doing at Berklee. If I had only had, processing experiences, I wouldn't have had that to count on. And so I was at Berklee for 6.5 years, but we eventually expanded the archive, so I was able to hire a processing archivist, expanded our footprint. I project managed a Grammy Foundation grant, did a lot of great things. But when I saw the Kennedy Center position, I couldn't really resist because it seemed like something similar to what I'd done before, but on a larger scale, and with an interesting museum studies component and exhibit work component. So I started here at the Kennedy Center about 1.5 years ago. Also the first archivist, so that is my brand now. I joke about it. I either haven't learned my lesson or it's just really my thing. But I like the things that are challenging. Right? Like I was drawn to archives specifically for the things that are a little bit on the edge of a lot of the literature. I was specifically interested in audiovisual, music, the things that aren't papers and photographs. So to be fair, I like a good challenge. And so here at the Kennedy Center, we're also staring down 50th anniversary, which is in September. So we have just completed the first comprehensive collection survey, and our collections are scattered across campus, which happens at a lot of places. And so now we're taking stock and trying to put together a couple of exhibits that will go up over the season. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. And it leads me into my next question about being the first in that position, which you do have a track record of. How has that been different than if there had already been, I mean, you were saying about the survey, are there things that were already in a strategic plan that you knew were coming up, or is this all from your vision?
So in both cases, to varying degrees, there has been a little bit of structure. So my first 2 years at Berkeley, I was there as part of an NHPRC grant. So there were very specific deliverables, a number of cubic feet that we were supposed to process, and various other deliverables which gave the framework. Within that there were additional things. I think in both cases, the good news and the bad news is that you're starting from scratch. So it's not like you're going to some repository and say, oh gosh, that previous archivists were not with it, or why did they do this? But you also have to pace yourself, because you're having to make a lot of just very basic decisions to do literally hard workflows. And juggling, a lot of different things. And also, coming into a situation where, in both cases, these were organizations that had existed for decades. There had been, there are always staff members who have a love for the history. In both cases, there have been attempts over the years, but something I'm very mindful of, to be pragmatic about it is, there have been obstacles, right? So I'm not going to come in and fix that immediately. But there are definitely systemic things that you just have to be very, persistent about. Here at the center, the pandemic has thrown a bit of a wrench in things. We were shut down for 4 months, so now we're just kind of trying to regroup with the new normal and trying to really prioritize the exhibit experience, which will mean a little bit less emphasis on some of the archival startup work, including processing, for a lot of logistical reasons. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good opportunity to sort of figure out what's important, to really get to know archival theory.
We have a bunch of students every year who go on our ARM concentration, and it's always fun to work with them and see what they're doing while they're in school. And it's become a little bit of a running joke with me that these students are so well prepared that then timing doesn't necessarily always work out in their favor. So they're ready to do wonderful things, and there's not always a lot of archival positions at entry level as they're ready to graduate. And so you mentioned about how your position had been a project and then had turned into a permanent position, and we certainly play that part up. But I wanted to ask two questions about what you would give advice-wise for students who are on the archival track. One is on how you were able to let potential employers know of this combination of your educational background and your practical experience. And then the second part was in terms of building your own network as you're trying to start in that world.
Yeah, so both really good questions. I'll start with the networking one first, because that is something I was very cognizant of when I came into SILS, and it's honestly been a really crucial part of successfully being a Lone Ranger, from a first ranger. So by the time I came to SILS, I was pretty focused. I'd done my meandering. I knew I wanted to go into music librarianship or archives. And so part of what I did, just curious. And my background in music is in ethnomusicology. So like anthropology of music. So I'm very much like, what is this culture? Where do I fit in? Who are my people? So actually, even before I started at SILS, I actually went to SIA here in DC. I was in Boston at the time. I went to a chapter meeting with the New England Music Library Association. And so I similarly did that at SILS. I actually sort of put together a list of, oh my gosh, all the different conferences that I went to, like production development, ALA, regional chapters, and workshops and things. And I found that that was really helpful, especially starting with the local organizations. And I know it's probably something students hear a lot about, from you or from others, but, the student rates are significantly cheaper than the professional rates, even for the organizations that have, sliding scales or make it based on income. And there are also a lot of opportunities. I was also very proactive about just applying for scholarships. Some didn't get others, but it was great, future practice for cover letters, just from, desensitizing myself to rejection, right? So I didn't get all of them. Later on the job, grant writing. So a lot of what you're doing is basically saying, give me money and advocating in a compelling way as to why you're a good investment. I was also, so when I relocated to Boston from Chapel Hill, I was very cognizant of the fact that, in Boston, there's Simmons. So there's a huge Simmons network. So I was very proactive in getting involved with NEA. And with NEMLA, I used to joke, I think of the diversity, I'm not a Simmons grad, right? And that was a great source of, colleagues to be able to get a good sense of perspective, because in that position, again, was the first, I was within the library, but I wasn't necessarily with librarians who had a lot of archive experience. So at times, it could just be a little bit lonely. And so there were a lot of good sounding boards, presentations came out of it, any and all opportunities for any kind of mentoring, I was there. So, from SILS to present day, that's something I've been very proactive about. Here in DC, it's obviously been a little bit stalled because social distancing and all of that. But it's a service-oriented profession, and I don't mean that in the vocational awesome, but just in the sense that we can learn from each other. And for the most part, folks are really generous, and I benefited from that, and so I try to pay that forward as well. In terms of the archives job market question, I feel like it's a little bit tricky. When I think about my trajectory and sort of the theme that I was thinking about in preparing for today, all I can really suggest is really just being as proactive and prepared and doing your homework, and then hopefully being in the best place possible when an opportunity comes in. If you had asked me, a few months before graduation what I thought my first job would be just based on my job experience, I thought I was going to be in psychology. Because out of all of my experience, in terms of just hours and months, processing was technically what I had the least applied experience in. And I knew that it was, competitive and all of that. And it just so happened that the Berkeley job opened up. That probably helped that I had lived in Boston before. The music background, all of that. But all I can really say is that, from the start, I tried to do my homework. And I was and continue to try to think of transferable skills and skill building. And now that I've ended up in these kinds of roles, thinking a lot about what other sort of disciplines or professions might have skills or vocabularies or frameworks that might help. So I know that doesn't really give an easy answer, but that's honestly always my caveat, that my experience, I acknowledge, is fairly atypical. I worked hard for it, I was strategic about it, but at the end of the day, the job market is what it is. I think the best you can do is to just know what your priorities are. Again, keep up with the professional literature and opportunities, and really focus on how you can explain transferable skills and why that makes you a compelling candidate.
Thank you. I feel like the explaining how your unique combination of background and skills is probably the hardest part to get students to understand. So the part about um, putting time aside to work on yourself for professional development, I'm appreciate that you said that in terms of making sure you're a student member of as many things as you can and getting exposure to as many things as you can. But when you're in that actual interview and your resume has gotten you to that point, do you have any insights for archival students in terms of things that if you were hiring an entry level person, like you mentioned that you had gotten to in your Boston position, what were some things that helped you understand that they'd be ready, to go from the get go?
In terms of me evaluating the position or me making a case to them?
In terms of you as a potential supervisor, what would you want an entry level
Oh, got it.
archivist to be confirming in an interview?
Got it. Got it. So I've hired for processing archivists. So for those kinds of roles, the cover letter is important because they will be writing finding aids. So I'm looking for someone who can write, clearly, concisely, and it doesn't have to be a long letter, but I need to see some indication that they've gone through the job description and have thought critically about how their particular skills map on to that. One common mistake I see a lot, and I probably did that myself as a recent grad, is really focusing on sort of coursework and extracurriculars, particularly the coursework part, because that part isn't necessarily as unique and doesn't necessarily tell me, as much about the job experience. Because of my own trajectory, and this may not, be the case for all hiring managers, especially those who maybe more traditional archives backgrounds, I really do look a lot at transferable skills, particularly because of the two situations in which I've hired, which have been atypical archives, right? So I'm looking for people who are going to be flexible and creative and aren't going to freak out if it isn't textbook perfect, right? Those are some of the big things that I look at. I think in terms of preparation, I remember this is something you addressed in a previous question. Something I found really helpful at UNC, and I don't know if this still happens, is that occasionally job talks were open to students, and I found that really, really helpful to see, what a job talk looked like, what kinds of questions were being asked. So it was slightly less mysterious when they went on the market for academic positions.
I have heard of our students, if they're in a department where there's a search going on, being invited to join those job talks. I don't know how widespread that is, but I have heard that routinely from students, that to demystify that process has really helped them then in their job search. You mentioned you had slides that you might want to share about some of the things you had done.
Well, sure. I mean, I think at this point, I had just tried to sort of outline. I'm trying to see if there's very much that we haven't already covered. Talked about experience. I talked about conferences, informational interviews, strategies. I think I covered what I did at Berkeley. Just kind of looking through. Professional development. The rest of it is just some photos relevant. So we can continue.
Okay, great. I appreciated what you said about the timing aspect, or a little bit of the luck. So you need to be prepared and you need to work hard, but then it may be uh, not exactly what you were thinking of for the first position. So for students that are in their job search in this pandemic time, where potentially their uh, assistantships were cut or at least somewhat impacted by being virtual, um, I've been to a lot of conversations with career professionals outside of this field who are saying, well, why don't you mention something you've done in the meantime? And do you feel like that would also be true, because there's not really a way you can kind of individually do your own archival project? Like, how would you want to hear from a potential candidate how they've made this time useful in their professional growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough time. I mean, it has been for a while, and I really feel for anyone who's in the job market right now or getting ready to graduate. I think it's a tough position, and I would hope, that hiring managers would be humane about it and really just look for some kind of, indication of transferable skills, and some way of framing what you've done in ways that can be beneficial. I mean, for me, if you look at my timeline, it kind of looks like it all lines up. But I know I graduated in August, and I finished my coursework in May, and I literally packed up my apartment, put it in storage, and didn't know where I was going next, because I came up here to DC to do the fellowship. I was writing my master's paper, and then I went back down to Georgia, where I left my car and some of my stuff. And that was sort of I had been applying throughout for positions, but I didn't have anything lined up at that point. And so, I was trying to be flexible, but also give some kind of structure. So I was still in go-getter mode. So I reached out to my undergrad alma mater, which had a university archives, and I was volunteering cataloging VHS tapes. I was in a position to do that. I realized not everyone can volunteer, and that wasn't necessarily something long-term, but at that point mentally I was still in sort of phase one, which is I was really trying to focus on music library and archives positions, recognizing that in order to be able to do that, I had to be flexible geographically. And again, for where I was in that time, I could afford to do that. A lot of the decisions, including coming to SILS, had been to try to minimize debt as much as possible so that I could be flexible. Again, I realized different people's circumstances will differ, and that may not be an option. And then it just so happened that I think a month into that volunteer work was when I got the job offer in Boston. So I had mentally prepared for this is going to take forever. I'm pretty sure I got that job maybe a week before I had in my calendar, okay, phase two, you have to broaden this, you have to be realistic. So it all looks like it lines up.
Right.
And the positions that I have landed in really synthesize, what I've done. But I also know, so many equally, talented and hardworking and accomplished, colleagues who have had, multiple project positions, some because of family circumstances, have applied those skills elsewhere. I think you have to do what you have to do at this point. And if there are ways to leverage your skills, if there are ways to keep up, with webinars, with any kind of crowdsourcing, digital metadata work, if there's any kind of way to stay plugged in, that would be my recommendation. But I also think, it's 2020, we're all just going to
Right. I appreciate you saying about the how some archivists starting out have a piecemeal approach, that they're going potentially project to project for a while. And I wanted to get your insight as a potential employer. Do you feel that if people can talk about the transferable skills there, that's not necessarily a negative? Because I have some students that'll say to me, I don't necessarily want to take that type of role because I don't want it to derail this trajectory that I have.
You mean like project positions that aren't directly related to the specialty they want to do?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think because my trajectory is atypical, as a hiring manager, I'm more likely, to look at transferable skills. And again, how you respond to the information that you have. Have you put in some thought into, why you want to work in this particular position? Currently here, it's not just, I want to work at the Kennedy Center because, I think it's fancy. It's like, what is it that you actually think you would bring? Are you excited about the work? And I also think that it can be tricky to navigate an entry level, archives career, in the sense that a lot of the work that you get as a grad student is in processing. A lot of the project positions are often in processing, and so it can be harder to break into some of those other roles. If I guess strategically, if you're trying to break out of that, my recommendation would be within whatever you can control, smaller shops, because you're more likely to have to wear multiple hats. That was actually the case for the first process archivist that I hired in my previous role, which is we were an archives of two. She was doing a great job with the processing. She was really creative. So she started doing some social media work and some other things, and she was eventually able to leverage that into a position that had a little bit more of an outreach role. So yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to you do what you got to do. And sometimes the question is, is there still something in that position? And honestly, it could even just be the paycheck, right? That will give you some stability to keep looking for something else.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you, a lot of archivist roles, you're a solo staff member or maybe a staff of 2 or 3. And I can guess that you're in a lot of meetings where you hold the archival expertise in the room. And so can you give any feedback to students who potentially will have one of those roles of how to not get sucked into an imposter syndrome phenomenon where they feel qualified to voice whatever their background and experience has been to make whatever progress is necessarily at that time? I think that being that solo person could be intimidating. And so can you talk about how you've managed that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely challenging, and I'm biased and it's all that I've known, but I think it's especially challenging when you're the first. Because when you're the first, there are really no expectation for maybe a lot of preconceived notions. I've worked in two sort of artistic environments where things happen quickly, and in a lot of ways, the maintenance work that an archivist does kind of runs counter to that. And so I think it comes back to really having a network of people that you can sort of touch base with. As Loner Rangers, the Loner Rangers Roundtable in SAA, the listserv, I found really, really helpful. It's actually one of the listservs I keep track of still, because people are just very kind and pragmatic and realistic. It's a certain type. Once you've had that kind of role, it really, again, makes you prioritize, I think, deepen your knowledge of the archival theory, but you have to apply it in very creative ways. I think going in, my approach, and again, I'm coming at this from training in fieldwork and anthropology and music, is you're coming into, and I'm again coming at it from not just lone, but first, right? Which is, I'm getting to know this culture, right? I'm getting to know this culture, I'm getting to know the history of this organization. And I'm really trying to listen first. And I think one of the things that's challenging is that, archives, the answer to a lot of things is it depends. And it can feel, very intimidating, especially at first when you're in quantity, maybe it's your first position to sort of be put on the spot for, folks often want a black and white answer, right? So what will it cost to preserve this thing? When can you digitize? Like, there's certain things that, yes, it's a black and white answer, but you have to be comfortable with sort of slowing that down, doing the full-on reference interview. Okay, but what is it that you actually need, and is there a way to marry that? But I think also being flexible. There's a lot of alliance building, right? Depending on how your position is set up, you're not going to be able to do everything. You're going to have to reinvent in folks like IT and other departments. And so while you are the expert in those kinds of positions, every interaction is potentially an outreach interaction, right? If you may be the first and the last archivist they interact with, you're countering the stereotypes of mean, shush, dusty, boxes, all of that. And so as much as possible, I try to focus on, showing rather than telling, right? Like, it's very different to say, it's hard for me to, I can't do a subject search on these, on this box of photos because there's no metadata. versus having someone, come in and look at it and say, oh, wow, there's really nothing written on these photos. And the titles are things like faculty and famous people. So of course you're not going to be able to do that kind of search, right? And so I think starting from a place of sort of good intent, curiosity, empathy, but then, also the element of self-care of, checking in with other archivists, because it can be draining, right? You're being questioned, you're having to do a lot of proving. And frankly, especially if that's your first position, you're having to really quickly become a generalist, right? And suddenly become an expert in all of things, which is not going to happen overnight. But I think the best thing, even just for your own, reliability, reputation, is just if you don't know the answer, just I will look that up.
Mm-hmm.
Again, being comfortable with, if I can't give a definite answer, that is okay. That is me doing my job.
Yes, thank you. I know you haven't been in DC long, but I know there's a lot of opportunities for our graduates in DC. So I wanted to ask if you noticed any local networking connections that you've made, or just the whole idea of how living and working in DC has been going for you.
I think that's another way in which my career trajectory is pretty atypical, that I've worked in Boston and here, so two pretty major cities. Again, by the pandemic, but I did join Merrick through the gender, keeping an eye out.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sophia. Your internet went out a little bit. I just heard Merrick, and then I missed the next part.
No worries. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've been having some connectivity issues because we're off-site. We have to VPN in, and most people are working from home, and so I think there are little dips during the day. So yes. So yeah. I mean, I've done my typical reaching out to a local chapter of SAA, but I haven't done too much beyond that. It does seem like there are a lot of opportunities. They tend to skew, from what I can tell, more like special libraries, corporate, government, records management. But there's Smithsonian's, there's Library of Congress, there are multiple colleges and universities. So I think if you're someone who's relatively flexible or fits into any of those, there's a decent amount of opportunities, especially in the other regions.
And in terms of lifestyle outside of work, do you feel like you are in a city mode from being from Boston? Is there a difference between that, or are they pretty similar city-wise in terms of transportation or how you have access to services and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely still a big city, and I live within DC proper. To me, coming from Boston, it does feel a little bit more suburban, particularly because there are a lot of folks that coming from Northern Virginia and Maryland. But there's still a robust transit system that will go out into the suburbs. When I was in Boston, actually, throughout most of my career, I'm a choir nerd, so I found a couple of groups to sing in. All of that is obviously on pause because of COVID. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of activity.
Thank you. Now, in terms of students who are in their second year, they're getting ready for their job search, and I talk to them about building a network, and then we can see all of these wonderful alums. How do you feel like students are encouraged to access alums to have a conversation, either an email conversation or a 20-minute conversation? Is that something that you would encourage, or is that kind of holds up from the rest of the work you have to do during the day?
I don't mind it. It's something that I took advantage of. I think the really important thing is to really do your homework and be mindful of people's time, right? So I know you know this, preaching to the choir, but it's not, if you're not looking for a job, it's not a social like a purely social interaction. The vast majority of informational interviews or sessions that I've had have been positive. But, occasionally it's just clear that they haven't really thought through it, or there's more of the onus on me. And so the things I recommend and like to see is in the invitation, they have 30 minutes of your time, right? It's something that's founded. Some indication of the kinds of things that you're interested in, why you're reaching out to that particular person, being like, you're in DC, or you went to the same school, like what is it that you want to specifically learn from that particular person? It should still be a conversation, but having some thought out questions. So basically trying to make it as easy as possible for the other person who may be being pulled in a lot of different directions, to give you answers that are as useful as possible, and who can possibly connect you to other people. That was one of the things that was surprising, especially when I was at SILS, and there were a lot of people that were in very generous teaching mode, which was, I talked to someone like, oh, you should actually talk to this other person. So yeah, I love doing it. I think the major thing is just, I feel better going into it if I have a sense that you've done your homework. It's going to be a sort of a founded thing, but I think it can help a lot, right? Because you may not be able to copy that particular person's trajectory, but it can also be really helpful to see the various ways that people make it to a particular position.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think preparation is so key, that it's not just walking in and a student being like, help me. And
Right.
it's like, that's not really the point. The point is to have the dialogue and the connection of why you even reached out to this person, and making that clear. We talk about that a lot with students also when they're doing field experiences, that we're kind of conditioned over time that when you walk into a room, you're kind of like, how can I help? And it's like actually the opposite for a field experience. You should say, hi, I'd like to get this experience, can you help me get there? And sometimes students have a hang up with, well, I don't want to be that direct, or I don't want to, make them, feel like they're kind of boxed in. And I said, it actually helps someone get that information from you of like what your priorities are, what your interests are, what you're thinking, helps them kind of, like you said, either craft the conversation, or, oh, you should talk to this person instead. I think those things are helpful. And it's an interesting twist, because I think it's the first time where they're kind of taking some ownership on their own professional development, which I think is a good skill to have before they leave SILS. So,
Well, and it reminds me a little bit too about some of the conversations around mentorships. Like I feel like a lot of times people sort of have this idea, myself included, like, oh, like you should seek out mentors, but there's often confusion with, like, what does that mean, right? And it can mean a lot of different things, but I feel like it's a similar principle. Where if you've done your homework, the mentorship could be as simple as a couple of sessions where you want to talk about a particular thing. Sometimes you really hit it off, and you might have a longer term relationship, but like the most successful ones I've had, on both ends, is again when there is a specific ask. And it doesn't mean that you have to have your life figured out. It's just, I have these, specific questions. This is why I think you're the best person. And again, giving boundaries of time. Things are too open-ended. It makes it a lot easier to say no, please.
Yes. I have been at SILS 8 years, and we've gone through mentoring every year. And there's so many of those, like you said, those barriers of like not overwhelming our alumni with just, a whole rush of students, going and asking random questions, but then also having that dynamic of, it could be a short term, getting a few questions answered kind of thing. So we're still working it out. We think we're closer. So, but
I'm still figuring it out. I only mentioned that, because it's one of those things that can feel, so ephemeral, right? Like, how do you create some kind of structure? So it's tough.
Yes. Well, those are all the questions I had today. I'll pause and see if there's any audience questions before we wrap up.
Hi, I may reach out separately, but you brought up something interesting, that you were a CALA, but you also did the field experience. How did that work? Didn't know that was even an option.
Yeah, so there was a lot of Tetrising over my summer, right? Because with the CALAs, it's a 12-month appointment. I was at the Stone Center Library, which is only open, or at least it was only open then, between Monday and Friday, which is also when the special collections are open. So I basically fit it in. I also was really lucky that my Cal supervisor, was very generous and very open-minded because she can see things as professional development. So I basically worked it out over the summer so that I was doing, I think, one day at Duke, and then the rest of the time, sort of splitting my time between the student center and the cataloging assistantship. And then I was really lucky, I owe Sean a lot, that as a result of the field experience, I was offered assistantship. And so I was able to basically split some of my Cala time so that I was doing both, still doing the same duties at the student center, just with fewer hours. Also doing the cataloging as well. So it's not necessarily typical, but again, proven my worth. And I was really looking. I started in the summer basically, which was the only time.
Yeah, we certainly have CALAs who do field experiences. So if you want to reach out to either of us for more information on that, we can. And like Sophia said, it really does come down to the flexibility of your employer. But most of them understand that there's a reason you need to do that additional project for whatever your goals are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful.
Good, good. Well, I want to take this time to thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And we will be recording this and putting it up on our website, and also sending out some surveys after the day to find out what other topics people want to hear from. So